Well, things in Ukraine, they've taken quite a dramatic turn, haven't they?
Yeah.
It's the 1,000th day of this war. Russia's pushing forward in the east. And now we get these reports that Ukraine may have used, get this, U.S.-supplied long-range missiles to hit targets inside Russia,
Right.
the ATACMS. And on top of that, we've got President-elect Trump coming back into the White House,
Yeah.
promising a complete, overhaul of U.S. policy. So much to unpack.
It is. It's a very tense and delicate situation, that's for sure. With so much uncertainty swirling around,
Yeah.
it feels like every move is designed to send a very specific message.
Right.
But the big worry is, what if someone misinterprets a message? The potential for things to spiral out of control is huge.
Yeah.
It really is.
Absolutely. And to really dig into this whole situation, we're going to be looking at a recent CNBC article, kind of dissecting it, picking it apart to really understand what's going on. So first up, these reports, mainly from Ukrainian media, that ATACMS missiles were used to strike a Russian military facility in the Bryansk border region. What's interesting is the Russian Defense Ministry, they confirmed the attack happened. They even said they intercepted 5 out of the 6 missiles fired. But then they say, oh, the damage was minimal. It's almost like they're trying to downplay it.
Yeah, it's a very calculated move, wouldn't you say? On one hand, they're acknowledging the strike happened, and they're highlighting the fact that Ukraine is using U.S. weapons against them.
Right.
Which plays right into their narrative that, the West is escalating the conflict.
Right.
But on the other hand, by saying the damage was minimal, it makes it seem like it wasn't that big a deal.
Right.
Almost as if they are trying to control the narrative.
Almost like they are trying to, control how people perceive it.
Exactly.
And what's odd is, on the Ukrainian side, there's been this kind of, silence from the top, I mean, there's this one security official who supposedly confirmed it to the Kyiv Post, but that's it. No official word from Zelensky or anyone in the top leadership. What do you make of that?
Well, it definitely raises some questions, doesn't it? It makes you wonder, was this like a rogue operation? Did some unit act on its own? Or are they intentionally trying to maintain a level of plausible deniability? Because, they could always say, oh, it wasn't us, we didn't authorize that strike. But then you've got to remember, their stockpile of these ATACMS missiles is limited.
Yeah.
Every single missile is a precious resource. They can't afford to just, fire them off randomly. So this is a calculated risk, no matter how you look at it.
Absolutely. So then what message are they sending? Do you think this is a message for Russia, for the incoming Trump administration, or for both?
It could very well be aimed at both, I would say. To Russia, it could be a signal saying, look, we can and we will hit back, even inside your territory. If you keep attacking us, don't think you're safe. But to Trump, I think it's more of a demonstration, showing him what they're capable of, and maybe even a plea for continued support. Because let's face it, Trump has never been shy about his skepticism when it comes to aiding Ukraine. He's questioned it multiple times.
Right.
They need to show him they can still deliver results, even if his priorities might be changing. They need to prove they're worth backing.
It's almost like they're trying to say, hey, we can do this, we can make a difference.
Exactly. Don't count us out just yet.
Don't count us out. But now let's get to the part that is, frankly, really unsettling.
Okay.
I mean, Russia's response hasn't just been about downplaying this attack. We've had Foreign Minister Lavrov outright accusing the West of pushing for escalation. And Putin just approved an update to their nuclear doctrine. It's chilling, isn't it? It's scary.
Chilling is an understatement. It's a deliberate escalation of tension, a way to keep everyone on edge, worried about what might happen next. And this updated doctrine, it's especially worrying because it essentially expands the scenarios where Russia might consider using nuclear weapons. It really does. It's a lot broader than it used to be.
So walk us through this. What are the key changes here? Like, what's different now?
Okay, so one of the most significant changes is this. Any aggression against Russia by a non-nuclear state, but backed by a nuclear power, can now be considered a joint attack. And according to this new doctrine, that could justify a Russian nuclear response. It's a very significant change, and it creates a lot of ambiguity.
So are we saying that in their eyes, in Russia's eyes, Ukraine using U.S.-supplied missiles like the ATACMS, that could be seen as crossing that line?
Absolutely. It fits the description perfectly. And that's not the only worrisome aspect of this doctrine. It's deliberately vague when defining what exactly constitutes a critical threat to Russia's sovereignty or territorial integrity. It doesn't clearly define what would trigger a nuclear response.
Right.
And that ambiguity is a tool in itself. It keeps everyone guessing unsure of where the red lines are.
Yeah.
It creates a climate of fear and uncertainty.
It's like playing a game where you don't know the rules and the stakes are incredibly high.
Exactly. And then on top of all this, you have President-elect Trump's return to the scene. His stance on Ukraine has always been a bit of a mystery, shall we say?
Yeah.
But most experts anticipate a significant shift in U.S. policy.
Or a shift. In what way?
Well, there's a lot of talk about him halting U.S. military aid to Ukraine completely
Wow.
and then pushing for peace negotiations. But negotiations that would likely be favorable to Russia, not Ukraine. Remember, Trump is a businessman at heart, right?
Yeah.
He sees everything as a transaction. And in this geopolitical game, Ukraine's fate could just be another bargaining chip.
So it's almost like Ukraine is stuck in this impossible position. They've got to project strength to discourage further aggression, but they can't afford to provoke Russia too much either, especially if they might lose U.S. support.
They're walking a tightrope
Yeah.
with very little room for error. And to make matters worse, they need to convince Trump that they're a worthy investment,
Right.
that their fight is worth backing. Matthew Samble, who's a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, put it rather bluntly in the CNBC article we're discussing.
What did he say?
He said the Ukrainians need to prove to Trump they're a good investment.
Wow, that's a pretty stark way to put it. It really highlights how precarious their situation is. But what about Russia? Are they truly ready to go nuclear, or is this just, tough talk, saber rattling?
That is the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
And honestly, no one knows for sure. Some analysts think it's all bluster, just an attempt to intimidate the West and get what they want without actually risking a nuclear war. But others, they see a genuine cause for concern. They believe Putin might actually be willing to use these weapons, if he feels backed into a corner.
That's terrifying.
It really is.
Yeah.
And what makes it even harder to decipher is they're doing both. They're talking tough, but at the same time, they're taking concrete steps to prepare for a potential nuclear conflict.
Yeah.
Like, for instance, they just announced they're going to mass produce these mobile bomb shelters, the KUBM units.
What are those?
Imagine, like, shipping containers. Basically, they're designed to offer basic protection from fallout and other threats, but only for a limited time, up to 48 hours. It's a chilling reminder that they're not just playing mind games here.
Right.
They're taking practical steps to prepare their population for the unthinkable.
So where does that leave us? It feels like we're staring down the barrel of a loaded gun. It's a very dangerous situation. What do you make of it all?
It's incredibly complex and dangerous. There are no easy answers here. The stakes are incredibly high, and the potential consequences are terrifying, really terrifying to even contemplate.
Yeah.
We've laid out the pieces on the board, so to speak. But the big question is, what happens next? What are the possible scenarios? What are Russia's options? And what does all of this mean for the world? Well, we're going to dive into all of that in part 2.
Stay tuned.
Welcome back. Before we go any further, though, I think it's important to, take a step back for a moment and remember what's at the heart of this whole situation.
Right.
Real people caught up in this terrifying game of brinkmanship.
It's easy to get caught up in, like you said, the geopolitical chess moves and forget that ultimately, this is about human lives and the very real threat of just unimaginable destruction.
Exactly. So with that in mind, let's think about this. What happens if the West calls Putin's bluff? What if he doesn't back down from all this nuclear rhetoric?
The consequences are, well, they're almost too terrifying to even think about. I mean, are we talking about like full-blown nuclear war?
It's a chilling thought.
Yeah.
But remember Timothy Ash, the strategist we mentioned earlier, he offers a different perspective, a slightly different perspective. He argues that if Putin is cornered, he might resort to something called asymmetric warfare, but targeted at Europe.
Asymmetric warfare, that sounds ominous. What does that actually look like? I mean, in practice, what would that mean?
Think of it like this: unconventional warfare. Warfare that's designed to exploit weaknesses and, create chaos. We could see cyber attacks that cripple essential infrastructure. Think power grids, communication networks, things like that.
Right.
Disinformation campaigns to erode public trust. Maybe even sabotage operations that target key resources, like energy pipelines or communication lines. It's all about inflicting pain and exerting pressure, but without resorting to a full-scale military conflict.
And haven't we already seen some hints of this? Like that incident a few months ago with the undersea cable?
Right.
The one between Germany and Scandinavia that was mysteriously cut?
That's a perfect example. I mean, it was never officially linked to Russia, but it definitely fits the pattern. Right?
Yeah.
Disrupting these vital connections, whether it's communications, energy, finance. It can create widespread panic
Right.
and economic instability.
Yeah.
It can really throw things into chaos.
So basically, what you're saying is Putin could try to bring Europe to its knees without actually launching a nuclear attack.
Exactly. It's a way to maximize pressure, but minimize the risk of all-out war with NATO.
But wouldn't that still provoke a massive response from NATO? I mean, they wouldn't just sit back and take it, would they?
Of course not. But then the question becomes, what would that response look like? Would they be drawn into a full-blown conventional war with Russia?
Hmm.
Or would they try to, counter these asymmetric attacks with their own cyber capabilities, their own intelligence operations? That's the dilemma.
It feels like we're in uncharted territory here. Like one wrong move, one miscalculation could have just catastrophic consequences.
You're absolutely right. And that's precisely why this situation demands careful strategic thinking from all sides. But here's where things get even more complicated.
Where's so?
Well, with Trump about to take over the White House, and given his, let's just say, friendly history with Putin, can we even count on a united and resolute Western response?
It's the big unknown, isn't it? I mean, Trump's praised Putin before. He's even hinted at maybe reducing U.S. commitments to NATO.
Right.
And a lot of European leaders are deeply concerned about what this could mean for their security.
And they have every right to be worried. They fear Trump might not be willing to stand up to Russian aggression, especially if it doesn't directly threaten, U.S. interests.
Right.
This could lead to a scenario where Europe is left to deal with this threat largely on its own.
And how would they fare against a Russia that's increasingly, flexing its military and cyber muscles? I mean, are they even remotely prepared for that kind of conflict?
That's the question that's keeping European defense planners up at night. They know they need to, beef up their capabilities, both in terms of conventional forces and cyber defenses. But it's a massive undertaking, especially when you consider the economic challenges that a lot of European nations are already facing. It's a race against time, and the stakes couldn't be higher.
Okay, so we've talked about, Russia's potential motivations, their tactics, and the possibility of asymmetric warfare. But what about Ukraine? What options do they have in this increasingly precarious situation? I mean, they're facing an adversary that's much larger, much more powerful, and they're potentially losing the support of their most powerful ally.
It's a truly awful position to be in.
Yeah.
They're caught between a rock and a hard place, with very few good options. One path, though it seems like a long shot, is to try and bolster their defenses as much as they possibly can, make it as costly as possible for Russia to achieve its objectives.
But isn't that a losing battle from the start? I mean, the difference in military strength between the two countries is enormous.
It would be a monumental undertaking, no question. They would need massive military aid from other countries. And, that might be difficult to secure if the U.S. pulls back its support.
So what other options are there? Is there any way for them to navigate this without making, painful concessions?
The other option, and this one's probably unavoidable at this point, is to try to negotiate some kind of settlement with Russia.
But that almost certainly means, making significant concessions, probably even ceding territory.
Most likely, yes.
Yeah.
The question then becomes, how much are they willing to give up to secure some kind of peace?
Right.
And can they even trust Putin to honor whatever agreement they reach?
That's a huge unknown. Putin doesn't exactly have a reputation for being trustworthy. He's broken agreements before.
Right.
And used deception to achieve his goals.
Exactly. And that's precisely what makes any kind of negotiation with him so risky. You're basically trying to strike a deal with someone who has proven time and time again that he's willing to, break the rules, change the game to get what he wants.
So it seems like Ukraine is stuck in this lose-lose situation. No matter what they do, they're going to pay a heavy price.
It's a bleak outlook. There's no doubt about it. But there are still actors out there who could potentially influence the situation, maybe even for the better.
Like who?
What about the international community? Could they play a more decisive role? Maybe help prevent things from spiraling further out of control.
It's a good question. They've already imposed sanctions on Russia, but those haven't exactly deterred Putin so far. So what else can they do? Are there any other levers they can pull?
There are a few possibilities. Some have talked about increasing the sanctions, targeting more individuals and companies that are close to Putin, really squeezing his inner circle. But that's risky. It could provoke him even further, make him even more unpredictable.
It's like a delicate balancing act, trying to pressure Putin without pushing him over the edge.
Exactly. It's like diffusing a bomb. One wrong move, and the consequences could be devastating. And then there's also the question of whether, Even stronger sanctions would be enough to change his calculus.
It feels like we're caught in this geopolitical thriller, where the tension just keeps building and building, and we're all just waiting to see what happens next.
And the ending? Well, that's far from certain. But one thing is clear. The stakes couldn't be higher.
We've painted a pretty grim picture so far, haven't we?
Yeah.
It's hard to see a clear way out of this, but even in the darkest of times, there has to be, some glimmer of hope somewhere.
Right. And I think, maybe surprisingly, one source of hope lies in the very concept that makes the situation so terrifying.
Deterrence.
Deterrence. You mean like making the consequences of aggression so bad that it actually prevents action in the first place? Exactly. The idea is to make it absolutely clear to Putin that any use of nuclear weapons or even a significant escalation of conventional warfare would be met with a response, an overwhelming response, utterly devastating.
But isn't there a risk that, by constantly talking about nuclear war, we're actually making it more likely?
Mm-hmm.
Like a self-fulfilling prophecy.
It's a valid concern, but history shows us that a strong and credible deterrent, it can actually prevent conflict. Like, look at the Cold War.
Right.
It's a terrifying standoff between superpowers with nuclear weapons, but it never escalated into a full-blown nuclear exchange.
Because both sides understood just how horrific the consequences would be.
Exactly. A concept of mutually assured destruction, or MAD, as it was called. It acted as a powerful deterrent. It's a grim idea, but it kept the peace for decades.
So are you saying that the key here is to make it absolutely clear to Putin that any attempt to use nuclear weapons would basically result in Russia being obliterated?
Well, it's a harsh reality, but yes, that's the essence of nuclear deterrence. It's the high-stakes game where the ante is the survival of, well, civilization.
It's a sobering thought. But in practical terms, I mean, what would such a deterrent actually look like? Would it involve, direct threats from NATO? Deploying more nuclear weapons?
It would probably involve a combination of factors.
Mm.
You need strong diplomatic messaging, leaving no doubt about the consequences of escalation. Economic sanctions would have to be crippling, hitting Russia's key industries, financial institutions, really hurting them. And there would need to be a visible buildup of military forces, both conventional and nuclear, showing a willingness and a capability to respond with overwhelming force.
So it's about projecting strength, but without, being overly provocative.
It's a delicate balancing act, no question. But it's one we've managed to maintain, even if imperfectly, for over 70 years since the start of the nuclear age.
But here's the thing, right? With Trump about to be back in the Oval Office and his history of seemingly being quite friendly with Putin, can we really present that united front? Can we be sure he's on the same page when it comes to deterrence?
That's the wild card, isn't it? Trump's unpredictable. His past statements about NATO, his apparent admiration for Putin, it's created a lot of anxiety, a lot of concern among America's allies.
Right.
They're worried that he might undermine the very deterrent we're talking about.
It's like adding another layer of fog to an already incredibly murky situation.
It's a time that calls for clear thinking, for steady nerves. The stakes are incredibly high, and the potential consequences are almost unimaginable.
It's a lot to take in. As we wrap up this deep dive, is there anything else you'd like to leave our listeners with?
Yes. I think amidst all the geopolitical maneuvering and all the talk of nuclear war, it's vital to remember the human cost of this conflict. The countless lives lost, the families torn apart, the dreams shattered.
Yeah.
War is never the answer. It's a tragedy.
That's an important point. It's easy to get caught up in the abstract analysis, but ultimately this is about real people whose lives have been irrevocably changed, damaged by this conflict.
Precisely. And beyond just staying informed, beyond engaging in constructive dialogue, we should all be asking ourselves, what can we do as individuals, as a global community, to prevent this situation from escalating further, to promote peace and understanding in a world that seems increasingly divided?
It's a question worth pondering. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into a truly complex and disturbing situation. We'll continue to follow this story closely and bring you updates as they develop.
Until then, stay informed, stay engaged, and remember, even in the darkest of times, hope is never lost.
Mhm.